Hey everyone, this is Mostly Casual Commander, where we do our best to keep our games of Commander fun without sacrificing our ability to win. I'm BK, and today I have a game of Commander for you. At the time of recording this, it is Kamigawa Neon Dynasty pre-release week, so we are thrilled to showcase two new commanders from the set in this game. So the commanders for this game are Shirei, Shizo's Caretaker, Millicent, Restless Revenant, Jin-Gitaxias, Progress Tyrant, and Isshin, Two Heavens is One. Make sure you're on the lookout for our next video where we'll be showcasing 4 brand new commanders from the Kamigawa Neon Dynasty set. Please keep in mind that we're just a group of friends, very average players, trying to have fun by playing our favorite game as well as producing this content for you. We really enjoy being able to do this. If you could, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and like the content you've been enjoying. So Azrael is kicking us off by playing a swamp as his land for turn. Then he passes it over to Busterkins, who drops Port Town. He keeps it tapped by not revealing a plains or an island. Over to Kovacs, he drops a fancy new island, beautiful artwork from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. Scalding Tarn hits the battlefield for Kyle, and he sacks that to go fetch up a Smoldering Marsh. That'll enter the battlefield tapped once he finds that. Another swamp hits Azrael's board, and he casts Thought Vessel. This gives him no maximum hand size, and it's a mono rock that produces 1 colorless. Over to Busterkins, he drops a Plains as his land for turn. Then he casts Sky Diamond and is helped out by a buddy to make sure it entered tapped. An island hits the battlefield for Kovacs, and then he passes right back over to Kyle. Exotic Orchard is his land drop for turn, and then he casts Robber of the Rich. This is a hasty 2/2 reaching threat that can exile cards from his opponent after it deals damage, and then he can cast cards that are exiled this way. So he unfortunately finds an island off the top of Kovacs' deck after dealing him 2 points of damage. Another swamp for Azrael's board, followed by Vindictive Vampire. This will allow him to start draining out his opponents whenever Azrael's creatures die. Busterkins has another Plains enter the battlefield, and he follows that up by casting Marble Diamond. Busterkins is rich with the diamonds. Next up, he casts Ghostly Pilferer. This should allow him to start drawing some additional cards. Over to Kovacs, he plays Sanctum of Ugin, and then he follows that up by casting Thematic Compass, allowing him to tutor up some more lands or turn it into a Mazavith later on. Kyle drops a mountain on his side of the board, and then he uses it to cast his commander, Isshin, Two Heavens is One. This also triggers Busterkins' Spirit. And then Kyle moves to combat, swinging Robber at Kovacs. However, there's no triggers because Kovacs has the same amount of cards that Kyle does. Azrael drops another swamp on his side of the board and says go. Busterkins plays Windborn Muse, another spirit, making it harder to attack Busterkins. Then he passes it over to Kovacs, who plays an island as his land for turn, followed by Joyra's Familiar, making his historic spells cost 1 colorless mana less to cast. Kyle draws and plays City of Brass. Now unfortunately, he does use City of Brass a couple times in the game. He forgets to take 1 damage, but we do catch it later on. Kyle also cast Hell Rider, and then when he moves to attack, he gets to chip away a little bit more because of Isshin's double triggers. Reckoner's Bargain is cast on Kyle's end stepped by Azrael. He sacrifices his Thought Vessel, gets to draw a couple cards, and gains some life. And then on to Azrael's turn in the beginning of turn 5. He drops another swamp, surprise there. And then he cleans up his board state. He casts his commander, Shirei, Shizo's Caretaker. This triggers another card draw from Busterkins' Spirit. And then he passes it over to Busterkins. He plays a command tower as his land for turn. Then he casts his commander, Millicent, Restless Revenant. Its cost is reduced because he has spirits on the board already. He moves to combat, chipping away at Kyle's life total. After the damage is resolved, it triggers, and he gets a couple of 1/1 spirit tokens. We're representing them here with the cool new Kamigawa ones, but they do have flying as well. Island hits the battlefield for Kovacs. Then he casts Workshop Assistant, which gives him the ability to bring back an artifact from his graveyard. Then he moves to combat, and he chips away at Kyle a couple more points. On to Kyle's turn, he plays Polluted Delta. As a land, he pays 1 life to sacrifice it, and he finds a swamp. Then he follows that up by casting Curse of Opulence, with Azrael being the enchanted player. This will allow him to gain some gold tokens, which are basically treasure tokens with a different name. So he moves to combat, and all of his combat triggers happen twice. Sadly, again, nothing for Robber, but he does get 2 Hellrider triggers and 2 Curse of Opulence triggers. We didn't have any gold tokens on hand, so we're using treasures. Kazul, Tyrant of the Cliffs, is cast, making him even more of a threat at this point. Snow-covered swamp enters the battlefield on Azrael's turn, followed by a Grim Tutor. So he's going to go search up his library for basically any card he wants and takes 3 damage. Then Azrael casts Bone Shredder and ETBs and destroys Kazul. Azrael passes the turn, and on his end step, Kovacs activates Thematic Compass, finding an island and putting it into his hand. Then on to Busterkin's turn, he casts Sire of the Storm. This will allow him to draw additional cards whenever he casts Spirits. Then he moves to combat, picking on Kyle a little bit more, dropping him to 22 and generating 3 1/1 Spirit tokens. And after that, he passes on to Kovacs' turn. Another island enters the battlefield. He then casts his commander, Jin-Gitaxias, Progress Tyrant. Jin-Gitaxias will copy most things Kovacs plays, and then will counter most things his opponents play. He moves to combat, chips away at Kyle a little bit more. On to Kyle's turn, he moves right into combat and swings at Azrael, and all of his combat triggers trigger an additional time due to his commander.
Really? Nice. What was it? 2 more lands? No.
Poor Kyle only gets lands off of Robber, and he can't cast those. Azrael declares some blocks, and those lands are permanently exiled, and with one of Azrael's creatures dying, it triggers his Vindictive Vampire. Bojuka Bog is then played by Kyle on a second main phase, exiling Azrael's graveyard. Atali, Primal Storm, is then cast, and that card just seems insane with Isshin out on the battlefield. Swamp hits the battlefield for Azrael, then he says go. Over to Busterkins, he immediately slaps a Darksteel Mutation out on Atali, making sure that Kyle cannot get 8 additional cards whenever he attacks. Busterkins then casts Mirror Entity. This will trigger his Sire, because Changeling is all spirit types, so he gets to draw a card there. He then moves into combat, swinging at all 3 of his opponents. This will generate gold treasures. It'll also trigger Millicent, getting him 4 additional 1/1 spirit tokens. Over to Kovacs, he drops another island as his land for turn. Then he casts Meteor Golem, which is copied because of Jin-Gitaxias. He blows up Windborn Muse, as well as Isshin. Then he goes to end step, and Thematic Compass will trigger, transforming into Spires of Orzaka, basically a Maze of Ith. Over to Kyle, he casts Elish Norn, Grand Cenobite, on his turn. This shrinks his opponent's board states to almost nothing, as well as pumps his team by getting +2/+2 to his creatures. On combat to Azrael, he gets 2 more gold tokens, and he passes the turn. Swamp hits the battlefield for Azrael again. Then he casts Exsanguinate for 0, and this will be countered because Jin-Gitaxias says no. But now that he's satisfied Jin-Gitaxias, he can cast Bolas' Citadel, seeing as he already had a spell countered by Jin-Gitaxias. So he now has access to the top card of his library, thanks to Bolas' Citadel. So he casts Swiftfoot Boots at the cost of 2 life. Then he casts Priest of Forgotten Gods, which will, of course, die by Elish Norn's static ability, but this will still trigger his Vindictive Vampire to drain and gain. Ayara, First of Lochthwain, enters the battlefield. This can increase his life gain, life drain production. He then finds a land and has to say go. So he passes it over to Busterkins, and he casts Ethereal Investigator. This will trigger his Sire, getting him a card draw. It'll also give him 3 clues. He then moves into combat, and Kyle still has that target on his back, especially now that he has an Elish Norn out. After combat damage, he makes a couple of spirits that, of course, die right away. Island hits the battlefield on Kovacs' board. He casts Soul Ring, which gets copied because of Jin-Gitaxias, so now he has access to 4 additional mana. Then he casts Chromatic Orrery. Not only can he spend mana as if though it were any color, but it taps for a super big mono rock. Because of the casting cost of that spell, he can crack Sanctum of Ugin, and he finds Conduit of Ruin from his library and puts it out onto the battlefield. With that, he searches his library for a Blightsteel Colossus and puts it on top of his library. Pretty threatening and pretty scary. Over to Kyle's turn, he casts his commander again, Isshin. 2 heavens is 1. He takes 1 point of damage off City of Brass. Then he casts Boros Signet to proc Jin-Gitaxias' counter. So that'll go to the bin, and then he is allowed to cast this next card, which is Jeska's Will. He's looking at Busterkin's hand, which equals 5 cards at this point. So he gains 5 red mana, exiles the top 3 cards of his library with Impulsive Draw. He finds Sky Knight Vanguard, a Plains, and a Concealed Courtyard. So with that, he plays the Plains as his land for turn. And then he uses some of that floating mana and that Plains to cast Welcoming Vampire. This doesn't really work well with Elish Norn out, but it's still a card that he was able to cast. He moves to combat, triggering Hellrider a couple of times, dealing damage to both Azrael and Busterkins, proccing some gold off of Curse of Opulence. And with that extra gold, he casts Sky Knight Vanguard. So he's making good use of that extra mana that he got, as well as those impulsive card draws. That said, Concealed Courtyard is exiled and onto Azrael's turn. He casts Gleaming Barrier, and Jin-Gitaxias says no. This opens up his ability to play other cards throughout his turn. Cauldron Familiar enters the battlefield, which of course will die from Elish Norn, but this triggers not only Ayara, but itself, and starts draining his opponents a bit more. He casts Blood Artist off the top, again triggering not only Ayara, but itself, and Azrael seems to be off to the races.
What's your life total, Kyle?
1.
He's fine.
The house is on fire.
It's right where he wants to be.
Everything's fine.
He's fine.
So Kyle is not feeling super great about his life total at this point. Azrael casts Victimize, which will return Vindictive Vampire and Cauldron Familiar to the battlefield, which sadly drains out Kyle, as well as drains his other opponents, but in this case it will knock Kyle out of the game. Good game though, Kyle, and an impressive showing of Isshin. So Dark Prophecy is cast by Azrael, so this will allow him to start drawing cards when his creatures die at the expense of 1 life. Azrael continues to make good use of Bolas's Citadel as well as his hand. He casts Ashnod's Altar, allowing him to start sacrificing his own creatures at instant speed. Doom Dissenter enters the battlefield, then he'll sack it. He'll get 2 colorless mana, drain his opponent some more, lose a life, and draw a card. So he certainly has a lot of synergy on his board state at this point, where he's cycling through his creatures that, benefit whenever they die, draining his opponents out and getting additional tokens, or getting mana in this case, making his opponents discard cards like Elvish Doomsayer will do when it dies. He drops his land for turn, because he hasn't done so yet. Then he kills his own Elvish Doomsayer, making his opponents discard cards. This also again triggers Vindictive Vampire. It triggers his card draw. This will also give him an Eldrazi Spawn off of Pawn of Ulamog. He sacrifices that, getting additional mana and draining out his opponents more. Then lastly, he wants to make good use of that floating mana.
Recast my commander, which unfortunately she's not going to see all these things that just died.
So sadly, without Shirei seeing those creatures die, they do not return to the battlefield. And with nothing left to do, Azrael had to pass the turn. A Plains hits Busterkin's board and he moves right into combat. And despite Aspires of Orzica untapping and removing a creature from combat, Busterkins is able to steal this victory by flying over his opponent's creatures. So congratulations, Busterkins. So we hope you enjoyed this game featuring some new commanders. It looks like we had a couple of life total issues throughout the game, but that's okay, it didn't matter at the end. As always, please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and thanks for watching.